Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and the Tenant of Wildfell Hall. At least one of those might have come from an RPG game the Brontë sisters played as children.
Papa bought Branwell some soldiers at Leeds. Emily and I jumped out of bed, and I snatched one up and exclaimed, "This is the Duke of Wellington! It shall be mine. Mine was the prettiest of the whole, and perfect in every part."
So begins the journal of 14-year-old Charlotte Brontë about the games they had started playing 4 years earlier. From the humble beginning of a box of toy soldiers, the world of Glasstown would grow to encompass nearly every facet of the Brontes' lives. Each of the Brontë siblings, save Charlotte, would play this game from the day they got the soldiers all the way until their deaths. And as we shall soon see, separating herself from Glasstown was no easy feat for Charlotte either. When I started researching this topic, I thought this was going to be another fun little role-playing game, kind of like the ones we've covered so far. We'd go over some funny stories about what went on and just have a nice lighthearted time while we tried to figure out how this ancient role-playing system works. And while this video is that in many ways, it also runs headfirst into the inevitability of this topic that the story of Glasstown is the story of the Brontë siblings. And that wasn't a happy story. Before we go forward, I want to make it clear the actual goals of this video and what we're trying to get out of Glasstown. This series is devoted to try and replicate these games so that you can play it at home, but there is a problem with that in regards to Glasstown. As you might expect of a family of literary geniuses, the game of Glasstown was about 1/5 gameplay, 4/5 creative writing circle. And they're not super forthcoming about the information on that gameplay fifth.
All our plays are very strange ones. Their nature I need not write on paper, for I think I shall always remember them.
So I have no way of actually piecing together the rules of how they played, assuming there were any rules at all, which actually seems quite unlikely. We will instead be focusing on how to adopt the literary aspects of Glasstown to suit the gameplay of any other campaign you might be playing. Which actually means in a really weird way that for the first time I'm delivering an ancient RPG to you that's 5th edition compatible. The other thing to note about it is that the Brontes wrote an incredible amount about this world they built. However, this video is mainly gameplay focused and more about the form of how they wrote these things rather than what they wrote. So we're not going to get super deep into the lore of Glasstown. However, if this video can hit 400 likes, I will assume there is enough interest to necessitate creating a second video that will just be a lore deep dive about Glasstown. Branwell, Charlotte, Anne, and Emily Brontë no doubt needed an escape from their lives right from the beginning. Charlotte was 5 when she watched her mother die, and she was 9 when she watched her 2 older siblings, Maria and Elizabeth, die before her very eyes of tuberculosis at boarding school. One should remember that while Charlotte and Branwell were absolutely the more dysfunctional of the 4 Brontes, they also went through quite the traumatic childhood that their younger sisters were mostly spared due to their youth. And so, with deaths in the family, and the gloomy climate of Yorkshire as the backdrop, the Brontë siblings moved forward after Branwell received his toy soldiers a year later. They began to refer to these toy soldiers as the 12s, or sometimes the young men, and from them they began to craft their narrative, telling the tale of how the 12s took a boat all the way down to the Gulf of Guinea, bidden by genies, who were sort of representations of the children themselves. There at the Gulf of Guinea, they settled down and formed a sprawling city called Glasstown, beset at all sides and at every opportunity by the native Ashanti people. There is obviously a lot of colonialism in the world they were building. Remember that this was the 1830s, and I leave it to you to come to your own conclusion as to what you believe about the nature of the colonial apologia within the setting. In any case, the story continued like this until the children began what they called the island play.
"At last," I said, Suppose we each had an island of our own. Branwell chose the Isle of Man, Emily, Isle of Arran and Bush Isle, Anne, Jersey, and I chose the Isle of Wight. We then chose who should live in our islands.
As we can see from this map, which was originally drawn by Branwell, we know that these islands that they chose, they moved into the Gulf of Guinea and then rescaled them to be part of the Glasstown setting. The most crucial part of this whole thing is that each of these children were given their own slice of the setting that they could write for themselves. Previously, being that these were technically Branwell's toy soldiers, he was sort of the primary storyteller, and Charlotte was kind of the secondary storyteller who was working in tandem with him. However, now that they each had their own island or land to work with, all of the children were now active storytellers in Glasstown. In 1829, however, the children began to write what is, in my opinion, the most important part of the game, which is the Blackwood's Young Men's Magazine. This magazine became the primary way that the children could write and get out what Charlotte called their scribblomania. Branwell dreamed that in his adult life he would love to write for the real-life Blackwood's Magazine. Therefore, he nominated himself as the editor-in-chief for the Blackwood's Young Men's Magazine of Glasstown. And he soon began taking submissions from his little sisters, although it was primarily Charlotte who would submit, as far as I can tell. The surviving Blackwood's magazines are really such a marvel of shared world building, and perhaps more remarkably, they were so unbelievably small that people had to use a magnifying glass in order to read what these children were writing. Both Charlotte and Branwell began submitting articles to the paper under the guise of various characters from Glasstown, each presenting differing and often even conflicting accounts of the events of Glasstown. In time, Branwell actually ended up growing bored of his role as editor of the magazine and allowed Charlotte to take over as chief editor, or in her words, the chief genius of the magazine. We can see from these writings that the young Brontës had almost a rivalry going on with one another. Several of the characters writing in were often critiquing the writings and stuff of the other siblings, such as Branwell's Sergeant Bud, who would constantly write into the paper to criticize Charlotte's degenerate editorial decisions. Or Charlotte's Charles Wellesley character, which frequently wrote into the Young Men's Magazine to complain how boring Perry's Land was, which was actually Emily's slice of Glasstown that she was writing. Of particular note, Charlotte actually wrote her very first novella at this time that was about Glasstown. It was called Albion and Marina, and it starred the Duke of Wellington, who was her favorite character that she liked writing about at the time. Hardcore Brontë scholars see this book, and many of them have suggested that this is sort of the proto-version of Jane Eyre. I don't actually take that as a dismissal of Jane Eyre or of Charlotte Brontë. I actually think it is a big selling point to the virtues and the goods that can come from role-playing games. But that's like a whole other video I gotta do sometime, so we'll just put a pin in that. By now, you may have noticed that there were some creative differences going on in this game. Anne and Emily had very little creative control over the game, and they often had different things they wanted to do. They wanted to create a slightly more realistic fantasy setting that was closer to Yorkshire where they lived than the tropical fantasy world that Charlotte and Branwell were hoping to build. Meanwhile, Charlotte and Branwell actually kinda thought that the stuff that Emily and Anne were submitting was really boring. Basically what I'm saying is that they probably should have had a session 0. Thus, the older children began to focus their attention away from the Glasstown Federation itself and focus on a swathe of recently conquered land on the border called Angria, which was mostly free of the influence of the younger children. Meanwhile, while Charlotte was away at boarding school in 1831, Emily and Anne took the opportunity to create their own spin-off land called Gondal. In Gondal, both of those children were free to have the creative world-building control that they never had in Glasstown. Charlotte, for her part, did her very best to play by mail, but was rapidly running into the problems with the fact that Branwell was kind of a bit of a problem player in some ways, and was extremely murder-happy with characters.
I wonder if Branwell has really killed the Duchess. Is she dead? Is she buried? Is she alone in the cold earth on this dreary night, with ponderous gold coffin plate on her breast, under black pavement of a church, in a vault closed up with lime mortar? I can't abide to think how hopelessly and cheerlessly she must have died. Charlotte, the Rowhead Journal, after finding out her brother killed her character while she was out of town. This was over her character dying?
From here, there's not much more to discuss about the actual form of the game. As I said, it was mostly a shared world-building writing circle. However, we still do have evidence as late as 2 years before Emily and Anne died. We do have evidence that they were still doing some live-action component.
Anne and I went on our first long journey by ourselves together. And during our excursion, we were Ronald McKelkin, Henry Angora, Juliet Angosina, Rosabelle as Malden, Ella and Julian Egremont, Catherine Navarre, and Cordelia Fitzifnold, escaping from the palaces of instruction to join the royalists who are hard driven at present by the victorious republicans. The Gondels still flourish, bright as ever.
It's also extremely clear from the way that Emily organized her work that Gondel was extraordinarily important to her. She kept all of her poetry in 2 separate notebooks, one for her regular poems and a second one marked the Gondel poems. Emily never stopped writing about Gondel, and she frequently would take those Gondel poems she had written and start scrubbing out the fantastical elements into a vaguely different form to make it sound like it's not a fantasy world, and would then publish them into newspapers and poetry collections. Anne, on the other hand, was probably not as into it as most of her other siblings, but scholars reading between the lines have suggested that Anne's primary concern with these games was as a way to interact with Emily. But from here, I'm afraid we've reached the high point of our story. It all kinda goes downhill from here. As I said earlier, Branwell's dream was to write for Blackwood's magazine, and from the time he turned 18, he was sending in applications to them. However, he was answered with silence, and eventually an outright rejection. He never did end up with a literary career like he wanted. Instead, he got by through several different jobs over the years and supporting himself where he could by selling a few paintings here and there. And then he started drinking. And he never stopped.
Nothing I did, man. You're just tired. Nothing I did, man. Hey, let's get you home.
Meanwhile, Charlotte, reeling from social pressures, a religious crisis, and a feeling of being chained to her childhood, finally made the painful decision that she needed to tear herself away from Glasstown and Angria. She wrote one final letter called Goodbye to Angria, and then moved on from Glasstown forever, looking back at it with a little embarrassment.
It is no easy thing to dismiss from my imagination the images which have filled it so long. They were my friends and my intimate acquaintance, and I could with little labor describe to you the faces, the voices, the actions of those who peopled my thoughts by day, and not seldom stole strangely even into my dreams by night.
Charlotte and her sisters began using male pen names in order to try and get published. Ultimately, they all broke through at roughly the same time. In 1947, we saw Charlotte publish Jane Eyre, Emily publish Wuthering Heights, and Anne publish Agnes Grey. All 3 of them actually ended up being unmasked the following year, and their real identities were made known. Branwell, however, never managed to make the mark that his sisters did, and by some accounts, he had been purposefully left out of the sisters' publishing efforts. For the rest of his life, Branwell continued to write about Angria. He submitted poems about Angria to local papers, always under the pen name Northanglerland, which was his favorite character from Glasstown. Branwell's alcoholism and soon drug addiction worsened after a failed relationship with a married woman. He died in 1848 of tuberculosis, which was probably aggravated by his lifestyle. In his final moments, Branwell insisted that he must die standing up to demonstrate the power of human will. And by eyewitness accounts, he did. This wasn't really how I wanted this story to end. I don't think Branwell ever really left Glasstown. And at Branwell's funeral, Emily developed a cough, which soon developed into the same tuberculosis which had just taken her brother's life. Famously private, Emily refused to have a doctor look at her. Her final words to Charlotte on the day of her death was to finally allow a doctor to come in. But by then, it was too late. It had been only 3 months since Branwell's death. Emily and Anne were practically twins, and so, while tragic, it's hardly surprising that she soon caught the same tuberculosis. She wrote to a family friend, Ellen Nussey, and professed her sheer disappointment with the fact that there was so much she still wanted to do. When her time finally came, her last words to Charlotte were for her to take courage. She passed on the 28th of May of 1849. In 8 months, 3 siblings, among the greatest literary minds of their generation, were gone. And for the second time in her life, Charlotte had to watch her siblings fade away before her very eyes. And with the passing of Anne, the youngest Brontë, the game of Glasstown ended the same way it began.
But thou art now on a desolate sea, parted from Gondel and parted from me.
As laid out at the start of the video, we're not going to be going super far into the rules of the live action element of the game, largely because we have very little information on that. If you're playing with a group of writers, or a group of people who are just looking to improve their skill at writing, then this game is probably for you. Even Charlotte, in a few places, even though she was very embarrassed by the fact that she played Glasstown when she was little, she absolutely acknowledged that it was tremendous practice and was immensely valuable to being able to put out the fiction that she did in her later life. The key things we want to copy for running a Glasstown-style campaign is we want to take the Blackwoods magazine, and we want to take the concept of island play. The Blackwoods magazine is such a cool idea for collaborative world building. Branwell, and then Charlotte, were the editors for the magazine, and would accept in-character article submissions from the other players for their monthly issue. A Glasstown-style game should absolutely have your version of a Blackwoods magazine. Decide amongst yourselves who's going to be the editor who will organize everyone's submissions into a small magazine or newspaper every month. And then just have fun writing as much personality into the magazine as possible. You can even interject inside of the articles themselves with opinionated or even flat out wrong editorial notes. Remember that contradiction is a big selling point here, so not everything has to line up one-to-one. If this person says this, someone else can say something that completely contradicts it, and it just creates this kind of wonderful living world. There is more than one perspective in the world, and this is your opportunity to show it off. The lost heir to the throne has now been restored to the crown. However, peasants are now writing into the magazine saying that, hey, you know what? Our material conditions have not changed compared to the evil tyrant, despite the fact that we just fought this big giant civil war over it, and was that even worth it? Most of the other writing the Brontës did about this was fairly informal into how it was set up, and everyone involved just sort of wrote on their own and showed it off to their siblings, so I would recommend you follow their lead, and encourage everyone, if they would like to write about the setting and the world you're building, they should absolutely feel free to do so. Encourage them to the best of your ability, and you should make sure that they feel very welcome to share those stories off with the rest of the group. The second part was island play. Island play was the part where all of the children were given their own islands or lands to set up and world build on their own for. they were the bosses of those regions, and they were the ones who got to make all the creative decisions. On the face of it, this is a pretty easy campaign style for you to do in your own D&D game, or any other role-playing game system you might be trying. However, it does run into a kind of unique issue. If every single player is on the fly world building and altering the world at once during gameplay, who's DMing this thing? There are two answers to that particular conundrum. The first is that you have a fairly traditional style game, and we'll talk in a second about how that works, and the other solution is more of a system in which everyone is the DM, and once again, I will get into how that works in a second. For a normal style of campaign, you can actually slot in Glasstown pretty easily. Like, the Glasstown island play stuff is pretty easy to fit into a normal campaign. In most homebrew settings, the DM has only really done the world building on the location directly around where the campaign is, and the rest of the world is usually kind of this foggy, half-built, nebulous mystery. So this is your opportunity to have each of your players start world building the surrounding locations. Then the game itself will take place in the particular land that the DM is world building. But you should be able to get a lot of those cultural impacts from those other locations that the other players have made. And you'll find traders and NPCs and stuff that are all influenced by this world you've all built together. That style should allow for a DM to run a fairly unrestricted campaign while still allowing their players to have their say with the world building. The second style, in which everyone is the dungeon master, is possibly a little bit closer to how the Brontës would have actually played. Now, there is an infinite number of ways to create games where everyone is the dungeon master, but I am going to recommend to you a style of game that I actually played in high school. So remember that this part doesn't necessarily come from the Brontës. This is just my recommendation for running a multi-GM campaign, and I think it slots very nicely into a Glasstown style campaign. The idea is kind of the reverse of a West Marches style game. So every time someone wants to be the DM, they'll book which days and which sessions they're going to be running the game. And they'll try and clear it with the party that, you know, I've got an adventure I want to do. It's going to be 3 sessions long. Everyone says okay. Everyone marks it in their calendars. At the very beginning, you're going to create this big empty map with the player hub right in the center. Now, this big empty map is not wholly empty. There's still geographical features. There's forests, there's mountains, rivers, coastlines, that kind of thing. However, nothing's really labeled. Whenever someone wants to run a game, they confirm it with the group and they book their session days, and then they go onto the map and they start marking out where their adventure is going to take and add any features that are needed for their game. If you're going to have the players visit this small town, well, go onto the big blank empty map and mark where that village is. We also kept a game folder when I was playing this in high school, and when you were writing lore for these locations, you would create little lore sheets for them and you'd put them into the folder so that everyone could consult those when they needed to use those locations. Over time, the world fills out on its own as everyone is running their own games, everyone takes turns. We actually did manage to have a group where every single person involved, even though most of them had never DM'd before, we actually managed to get everyone to DM at least one session. Combine this mode of play with your version of a Blackwood's Young Men's magazine, and you will have everything you need to create a Glasstown style campaign. Before we fade away completely, I would like to thank Pixie's Grove for doing the voiceovers in this video. She's another D&D YouTuber. She's extremely talented. Go check her out.
Hey, Pixie here. Huge thanks to William for having me on. I also make videos about D&D. I focus on the social, emotional, and narrative side of things. Come check it out at Pixie's Grove. It's me, I'm the Pixie. And subscribe to William.
I mean, she was not, I didn't tell her to say that, but she is right. So, subscribe to us both.